use the chat box, go ahead and open that and introduce yourself. We'll also be using that to take questions. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, my name is Morgan Jones King with the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. I work with Brian Collars, who's our presenter today. I am the electronic records archivist and happy to be moderating. We do have another webinar coming up next month, so feel free to register for that as well. It will be the Alabama State Archives, and bit by bit, it's a overview. Our blurb is that in 2017, the NHPRC awarded the Alabama Department of Archives and History funds to launch the Alabama State Electronic Records Project. So we'll hear a little bit about that, and it is geared towards archivist practitioners and archivist managers, and no technical experience is needed. And then the fall 2019 series webinars start in September. Also, we have the series online recordings. We have the Managing Digital Content Over Time recordings that are very useful if you're looking at how to begin to even think about digital preservation, electronic record preservation, and that is available at the link on this slide. And hopefully we'll be having more educational videos coming soon. All right, today's presenter is Brian Collars. He's the supervisor of electronic records and imaging at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. He has been with the agency for 26 years in a variety of roles, including accessioning, processing, and many others. In 2001, he moved over to electronic records and digitization, as well as micrographics. So wealth of experience. Right, Brian?
So they say.
Time is a wonderful thing. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we are going to hold questions until the end, but please feel free to ask them during the presentations so that you ask them while they're fresh. But just put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. And I'm now going to go ahead and have Becky turn navigational control back over to Brian.
All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where in the United States you're from. I'm glad to be here, and hopefully I'll be able to give you some information that is fresh and new. Although when I created this webinar 18 months ago, it was much fresher and much newer then. A lot of stuff has happened in the last 18 months within the profession and here at the archives, so that some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is pretty well known or you've already experienced on your own. But in any event, we're going to press forward and do what we do, and hopefully we'll all learn something from the process. So, well, it worked a little bit ago. Here we go. I'll give you a little bit of background. In December 2016, our governor unexpectedly left office in the middle of her second term and accepted a federal government position. The departure and subsequent transfer of her records to the state archives staff presented us with an opportunity to deal with records that were managed, stored, and used in Lockheed Martin's or Leidos' IQ software. So today's presentation I like to call IQ and You, or How Not to Fear IQ in Lockheed Martin. It's an homage to a famous movie. Moving forward. Oh, come on. When the governor, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley left office, there was some trepidation here at the archives as we were unsure of how the records we would receive the records from her office, if we got records at all. In February 2014, in consultation with us, the governor's office had begun using Lockheed Martin's IQ software to manage their correspondence records, both at the electronic level as well as analog mail coming in through the U.S. mail or faxes or other formats. At that time, we had cautioned and encouraged the governor's office to ensure that the records in the system could be retrieved in a format that was usable and transferable to the archives, but we had no assurance that that was going to be the case. So we were waiting for the records when she left office. she announced her intention to leave office. Her staff was fully prepared to begin the process of the records transfer within 60 days. This included the records stored in the IQ system. So that by February 2017, when we received notification from the governor's office was ready to transfer the IQ records, we were still unsure of how we were going to get them. However, when the flash drive arrived into the archives in an envelope, we were relatively surprised to find that what we received, in fact, was a Microsoft Access database of files that had been extracted from IQ by Leidos or Lockheed Martin. We were grateful and thankful we received the files and accesses of something we could work with, at least initially. And so we were hopeful that what we received was something useful. And I'm going to go through exactly what we received. What we received in the connected flash drive was a simple file structure that contained 5 folders and one database, one access database. Ignore the renumber folder there. That's something we added later. So what you'll see here is we received 5 folders titled Form Letters, IMA, IMAIL, Individual Letters, Objects, and the Correspondence Archive Access Database. So what were the folders? The database is a key piece in this image, but what was contained in each of the folders? I've got a lot of slides, and I'm going to try and go through them rather quickly here as a matter of housekeeping. So we will move forward. So the form letter database contained form letters in this format. So you'll see what we have here are docs, Word docs, PDFs, TIFFs, more docs, and these are each individual records stored within the IQ system depending upon how they came in. The Word documents tended to be stuff that was created electronically in the office. PDFs tended to be scanned images of either emails or or analog documents that were mailed to the governor's office. TIFFs tended to be scanned images of something. There's just any variety of documentation, and you'll notice that each of them has a code number associated with them that is individual and unique. Well, we open up the IMA folder, and it's filled with very similar stuff, except that these have the form number with a dash or underscore followed by another number. And in some instances, other than the other number, so if you look halfway down the image on the left-hand column there, you'll see a code number 5030485_1, followed by another piece of PDF with 5030485_2. This is somewhat troubling as the image or those particular documents have the same reference number, just a different number on the other side of the underscore. If we move forward just to continue this process, the IMAIL folder contained very similar stuff, but we also have pings, HTML documents, .eml documents in here. Once again, following the similar structure to a code number followed with an underscore and another number. Moving forward, individual letters. Here we have text documents, .emls, docxs, so any variety of stuff that IQ or the IQ system is storing records in that was shifted back out to us at the end of the process. And there's one more folder, and that's objects. And objects contained any number of very similar stuff. So what did all this mean? How did it interact with each other? There's a lot of material. We had over 160,000 individual items in these 5 folders with no rhyme or reason of how to interact with them. So, of course, finally, what did the database look like? And here is the switchboard or the dashboard to the database, which was the main interaction page of how you're supposed to access the records vis-a-vis as Lockheed Martin or Leidos sent to us. You have these search boxes where you can put in the search features that you'd like, the date that the correspondence was received or the date that it ended, first name, middle name, or last name of the correspondent, an address, a zip, an affiliation code, which they never fully described to us exactly what that was, or an issue code. And then so this was the way you were supposed to interact with the data. Well, let's see how useful that was. The company instructions specified the preferred method of retrieving a piece of correspondence. We use this search screen within the database. So a search for James Smith would return a search screen like this, and I know it's kind of small, and I'm going to blow it up for you here in just a second, but it would return the following segments of information. So if we blew up just the left-hand side of it here, what you'll see is it has an incoming ID number, an outgoing ID number, the date that it was received, the incoming method. This, in fact, is a phone call, so they were recording phone calls in the system as well, who the phone call was from, and the phone number. Moving forward, the upper right-hand corner of it would have the street address, the city, the state, mail comments, workflow ID, things that are not populated because it was a phone call. And then the lower right would contain incoming attachment, outgoing letters, and you'll see that all of these are blank. So because it was a phone call, there was no hard piece of correspondence for them to scan or copy in or record. It was just a record of the phone call, which had ramifications later on when we started dealing with the actual data. But what's important to note is down in the lower left-hand corner, this is actually record 1 of 24 on the search for James Smith. So if we advance this a little further and select number 3 of 24, you'll see something very similar in terms of the way it returns the hits, except that this isn't a piece of mail. And in the lower right-hand corner, it actually relates to 2 objects, or an incoming attachment and an outgoing letter. So what you have is links to actual documents, and if you were to select on one of those, so if we open the attachment link for the text file, this is what it returns. It would open it up in text, and this is an actual email to the governor's office detailing any variety of material, the surrounding wrappers, who it was from and who it was to, and the body of it is down there at the bottom. So if we move forward, then the second one, the outgoing letter email link, opens this doc file, which is a return email, and they just kept the body of it. There's no wrapper other than the fact that Lockheed Martin says that this went with that piece of email. So overall, the database was functional, but it had many drawbacks. The primary one is that it's an access database, and we couldn't access it. You know, it's well and good to be able to access this in our search room here in at the archives, but it certainly doesn't function as a web-capable version of the data that many people expected or hoped to have. And plus, it doesn't fit within our preservation system. We can certainly bring in the access database into Preservica, which is what we use here, but it doesn't allow us to search it in any functionality. You have to pull it back out. So as I thought about it a little bit more, and I investigated it, what drew my attention initially was the incoming and outgoing ID. Now, these are code numbers, and numbers are intriguing, and numbers tend to be unique, and they're things that we can work with. But why were there 2 separate numbers? Normally when you think of a code number for a piece of correspondence or a correspondent, you think that they're going to use a single one. So why were there 2 separate numbers, even though they were tangentially very close to each other, 5019755 and 5019435? What did those relate to, and how did they relate to each other, or did they relate to each other at all? So I stepped back and I looked at the database as a whole, and what following tables drew my attention: IMA, IMAIL, incoming and outgoing. Well, these clearly to me indicate that this is a record or tracking table for outgoing correspondence, incoming correspondence. IMAIL, as I've learned through the process, is actually attachments to mail coming in, and IMA is attachments for mail, email coming in or going out. So these are tables that relate to the records themselves, and if we open them up, this is what it looks like. This is a segment, a portion of the incoming table. And what you'll see is it has both an incoming ID, an outgoing ID, the date it was received, the incoming method, whether it be IMail, which is snail mail, or email, or a phone call, U.S. mail. It details all the manner in which incoming mail was coming in. An issue code, in this instance, legal, immigration. It was like a one-word code that the governor's office used to function or disperse these records out. The prefix, the name of the individual who sent it in, first name, middle name, last name. If it was an email address, they included the email address. If the individual had a specific title, such as executive director or founder of an organization or something like that, they listened. As you'll see down there near the bottom of that column, there's an inmate number. You also have the street, the city, the state, the zip code, and then an attachment. And you'll see that these might primarily relate to objects, which relates back to the object folder. And so I inadvertently didn't expand that field for y'all to see the full thing, but it includes the object folder and a code number. And if you were to manually go search for that code number, you could pull up the document. So there was a link here that I felt that we could exploit because it's data, it's in a table, and it's manipulatable, and there was an opportunity for us to utilize this information to provide item level indexing and item level retrieval to these records in our in Preservica, but in the manner in which we did that required us to have an XML file. And the bulk of my time in this talk was designed to talk about how we go from this table situation here in a database and create an XML file that linked the individual objects, letters and stuff back to the metadata itself. So we'll expand upon that. Well, here's a blow up of it. I apologize. I should have remembered this. So this talks once again. This is a snippet of the outgoing table, but you'll notice that the incoming and outgoing columns are switched. So which one was one of the primary issues we had originally was which one of these was a primary field? Were they both primary fields? Did they duplicate? Those are questions you have to ask yourself. And when the lines of metadata or the data in these tables ran to 60,000 lines in some instances, trying to merge those and figure them out was quite an issue, and it's something that we worked towards and we were able to overcome. And you'll notice here, if you look at this blow up here, about halfway down, you'll notice that the code or the line for Wayne Standifer from 1303 Bow Creek, Duncanville, Texas, he actually has an attachment and an outgoing letter. So these are, two objects that relate to a single individual, and the same thing with the Dan Martini of the U.S. submarine from Washington. He's got two objects as well. So how did those relate? How did we provide metadata for two objects that needed to be individualized? These were things we had to work out. The metadata, this was metadata we could use. Given that we had opted in just records at the item level, thereby giving researchers the most accurate return on their queries. However, to do so required us to have an XML file on a one-to-one level that contained enough metadata to allow the retrieval of records by the following fields: the name, the date, the topic, issue code, the respondent, if there was one, an item number, and a location or where they lived. One of the things we opted to not track was actual addresses and emails and phone numbers. So even though they were in the data set, we didn't feel like it was our business to reproduce that for the public. So we manually redacted those and removed those from the metadata as we created this file. We kept the original file so that we have a 100% accurate record of what was transferred to us in Preservica, but we don't access that to the public currently. So this is what our goal was to create this metadata file right here, which lists the title of the record there. The top is administrative metadata that relates to to the South Carolina Archives. The title, the identifier, and the subject are the two code numbers that are related, and one's an outgoing and one's an incoming. We opted to choose the outgoing ID number. No, I apologize. We opted to choose the incoming ID number as the identifier for the files because most of the material was incoming rather than outgoing. There's administrative metadata such as the creator, the date it was created, which is comes out of the database itself, the date we made it available to the public, some other administrative metadata that we supplied during the process of creation of the XML file. And then as we get down towards the bottom, you notice then we have these subject tags right here. And so this is where you would include the correspondent or the person sending the email or the correspondence in the subject that it was related to. This is probably related to Thomas Ravenel and his TV program, Southern Traditions or something like that, congratulatory letters and whatnot. So how did we go from the database, an access database in those tables to an item level XML file that relates specifically to a specific piece of email when you have like 150,000 pieces, and how do you do it effectively and quickly? I will say that when I started this process, it took me roughly 3 to 4 weeks to figure out how to do everything from start to finish. But once you worked on the process and we got through it and everything was said and done, we were able to process all 150,000 pieces of correspondence in a matter of almost 4 weeks to do it all completely. So there are 12 steps that there were 12 steps for the creation of the XML document from the database itself. The first was convert the tables and access to a single Excel spreadsheet. So what we were able to do is we copied them all out of the access database and included them in one. Stop calling me. I'm sorry. Somebody keeps calling me. So we converted them to an Excel spreadsheet, and this we were able to include them on a single table essentially and find duplicates and eliminate all the phone calls which were not actual pieces of correspondence. They were just metadata that tracked those. We've kept that stuff, but it doesn't match up with any piece of correspondence, so there's no reason to keep it in the tables or create an XML document for it because it pointed to nothing. In Excel, we organized some metadata so it was consistent across all fields. We applied all the added metadata, such as the organizational administrative metadata that went with this agency at that time as well. So I could I could go over, I didn't include images of this stuff because I was sort of running long on my slides, but if necessary at the end of this, I can pull those up on my active desktop and I'll show you what it looks like. The third step was eliminate fields in the metadata we didn't want or were unnecessary: phone numbers, addresses, zip codes, etc. This streamlined the fields and the metadata that we had, and it was consistent so that at the end of this process it was a solid block of information that ran almost to 15 actual rows across the table. And once again, we added institutional metadata. So it's a solid step of process within Excel, and I have to say that I love Microsoft Excel, and spreadsheets are wonderful things. Once we finished all that and we had everything necessary included so that each row had all the metadata needed. So it would have the administrative metadata as well as the discoverable metadata to access the records themselves. We returned the spreadsheet data access so that we could arrange it as required by our decision of how we wanted to ingest the records into Proservica. And in our particular instance, we wanted to do so in discrete chronological groupings, because trying to ingest 150,000 items at any one time was just overwhelming. It overwhelmed Proservica at the time. It tended to, if there was any disparity or errors in the XML documents, they would kick it back out. And if you process, 90,000 emails or 90,000 pieces of correspondence and then it kicked it out, it eliminated everything. You had to start over again. So we opted to do it in smaller chunks in discrete chronological groupings. And then once we got all that secure, meaning that we had these tables in their groupings, and the groupings we decided upon were quarterly groupings. So we had a group of we were ingesting in quarters of the year. So there's 4 ingests per year based upon the quarter. We would export the metadata from Access table to a single XML file. So in Access, you can actually export the entire table into one long XML file. And but you had to, once you did that, you had to form it presented itself, but you had to edit it in Notepad. We edited in Notepad++, which enables you to edit across large spans of document, and it helps you form proper XML tags, because Access only exports the tags without the closing tag. Actually, it just exports the front tag as both the front and the closing tag for a property or an XML tag. It doesn't actually put the slash on the second tag. So you have to edit them in some format, or this is what we did at the time. Edit them to make proper XML tags and eliminate things like quotation marks that a well-formed XML tag or XML document doesn't have, or if it does have them, it has them as a single thing instead of special tags. Special characters and things like that tend to throw a Proservica off if they show up in an XML file. So as we're doing thousands of these things, it's sometimes easy to miss them. So Notepad++ is a really well-made program that allows you to pick those things out and correct them. Then once we had one long XML file composed of individual little XML files, but they were all butted up against each other in the file, we ran a text file splitter program against the XML, and we used GSplitter, I think is what the title of it is, against the XML file, and it split it into individual XML files that we hoped or should match up to the individual documents found in those original 5 folders when we started this process. So we run that, created any number. Sometimes there would be 5,000, sometimes there would be 10,000 individual little XML files that were created as a process of running the text file splitter program. And then came the most awesome thing in the world. If you do not have bulk rename utility, I highly recommend you find it and use it, because it is the most wonderful program ever created. But it's a rename utility that allowed us to rename the XML files to match the file names of the records with the added extension .metadata added, which is what's required for Proservica to match a metadata or XML file up to a document during the ingest process. So what it does is it takes that metadata file or that XML file we just created and matches it up on a one-to-one basis with the record you're intending to ingest into the system, and marries them together so that when you search for it, you can search across the XML file that's associated with the document and returns it. So bulk rename utility allowed us to change the file names that's created by the text file splitter into a name that's related to the actual record. And it didn't marry them together, but at least it allowed you to look for the records And I'll show you that in just a moment when we finish and get to the question and answer period. Number 10 was to double check that there was a metadata file for each record in the set that was to be ingested. And this was the most time-consuming process. And so that basically you had to look at the individual ingest folder and make sure that every other one was a metadata file, and every other file was a record file, whether it be a .doc, a .text, or some other file structure or file extension like that. What you were looking for was a pattern. And so like I said, some of the folders had 5,000 items in it, some of them had 10,000. Just visually, manually going through those folders, those ingest folders, making sure that you had a 1-to-1 ratio was the most time-consuming thing that we went through in this initial process, or when we first started this 18 months ago, essentially. And I can't remember the days that I would run through and say, well, you know, there's supposed to be 5,000 of these and 5,000 of these, 10,000 files in here. Why has one got 4,999, and where's the break at? It was maddening. But we were successful, and we finished it up. And then we moved to 12. And then step 11 was to ingest them, or at least try to ingest the paired records in his metadata file. You know, the smallest thing that not formed correctly in an XML file will invalidate the ingest no matter where it is. It could be, you know, 10% into the ingest, it could be 90% into the ingest. And Proprietary just stops the process, and it doesn't exactly give you a detailed reason why it just stopped it. It just ended. And if you weren't watching carefully, you couldn't really tell where it ended. So we spent a lot of time watching the screen, and that little green bar inch across the screen, inch by slow inch. And then it would quit on you. And you sort of had an idea that if it quit 75% of the way across the screen, you were somewhere looking 3/4 of the way through the file structure to find an error. Sometimes it was easy to spot, sometimes it wasn't. And then if the ingest was successful, guess what? You get to do it again and again and again. But what does it actually look like when you're finished? So here's our instance of Proprietary, and this is a central correspondence file, which is what these records were, of Governor Nikki Haley. And you can see that along the left. We have some descriptive metadata for the series as a whole. As we move forward, you'll see that these are our quarterly results, or our quarters of correspondence that we entered. So the first one was in 2014, first quarter. Even though she left office in 2016, December 2016, they started using they're using IQ and the first quarter of 2014 to track both electronic and paper records. So the quarters run along here, and they're fairly consistent across the board, as you can see. So if we were to look in, so this is the second quarter of 2014. You see we're starting to get into actual individual documents, and some of them are PDFs and texts and TIFF files, etc., etc. And if we open up one of those TIFF files, it looks like this. So you'll see that it's got a 2014 with a supplied number alongside .tiff, and this is the actual document as related. I'm trying to see if the metadata here along the side. So this is the supplied metadata of the XML file that actually gets you back to this document. So if we were to look for one of the subjects is General Maddox, or Garland Maddox, wrote this particular piece of correspondence. If we were to search for this on the live web, it should pull it back up based upon that. So in any event, we were successful in marrying the data that was coming out of IQ, which was supplied by the governor's office. Well, IQ supplied the IQ data to us in Access, which was a huge surprise to us. We'd asked them for that. The governor's office actually paid for it, and we were highly successful at pulling it back out and indexing and ingesting at the item level, so that people are able to get at what they're looking for, hopefully. So what we learned, and I'm going to go back and go to the live system because I've got plenty of time to do so now, and I'll take your questions and we'll look at how some of the stuff that I sort of, I won't say glossed over, but breezed through, we'll look at it in detail. IQ is not to be feared. I think if you coordination with the record creator and you're successful in getting the data out of the IQ system into a format you can work with, this is vital. Some of archives are going to be more successful at this than others. I think the actual raw data in the proprietary IQ system is workable. I suspect it's either in a SQL system, not having seen it yet, but I suspect it's either in a SQL system or maybe an Oracle system. But all in all, it's data. And once you get at the actual tables of the data in whatever format it's in, I think that there's an opportunity for us as a profession and as archivists to work with that data, to pull it out, tease it out, and make it useful to us in whatever system we're using. If we can get it transferred or transformed from whatever system it's in into an XML data, it's certain we will be able to get this workable. The use of the ID numbers was critical in deciphering the manner in which the data was related to each other across the different tables and access, resulting in an experience that enabled us to speak with other records creators and receive similar metadata structures from them as well. We've been able to translate our experience with this data into talking to other data creators or other records creators across state government here in South Carolina, and if I'm able to get them to dump or give us a download of their data, especially in a CSV file, we can use this same sorts of processes to create individual item level indexes and item level access to the records they're providing for us as well. This has resulted in the last 2 years or last 18 months has ingested an additional 150,000 plus records at the item level using this same procedure. We've ingested birth certificates, other pieces of correspondence, emails coming out of .eml structures with this format and ability and whatnot. We also learned that while time-consuming processing electronic records can be an effective means of gaining access to these records through the use of modern software. I couldn't imagine trying to index 150,000 pieces of correspondence 20 years ago when I started. That would have almost been a career for me to do it at the item level. Now we did it in basically a matter of 2 to 3 months from transfer of the records to ingestion. And finally, experience with the government records that were in IQ forces, South Carolina, the staff here at the archives seek out ways in which to streamline the 12 steps as we originally designed them. Today we can accomplish the same process in only 6 steps, many of which are automated and accomplished in a matter of minutes rather than hours. And I'm going to show you the code for that. It's here on the webinar. You can download the slides that get to this code. It uses a lot of batch processing and macros to accomplish many things, such as the marrying up of the XML or metadata files with the actual document, as long as they're titled the same thing. This macro will go in, find the matching pairs, extract them, and put them in another folder so that you don't actually have to manually do it. It just automatically does it, leaving you with the stuff that doesn't match up in the original folder. So it took that step that took me many days and many hours to do, and it does it automatically in a matter of minutes, actually. So there's 3 slides of this stuff, and this is steps 1 through 3. And it, like I said, this will be available for you to digest at the end and download, and you're free to use it if you'd like. Morgan has conveniently provided instructions to this stuff as well, and I have to give Morgan Jones King credit for this. Morgan Jones King. This credit for creating this. It was the bulk of it was her work, but as I said, 1 through 3. And here's step 4, and this is on actual 2 pages. This is a code tool that creates the XML files. And if it looks like gobbledygook to you, well, we'll be willing to work with people as needed. If you want to contact us after the webinar to talk about how we go through this and how the process works, we'd be more than happy to talk with anybody and get online, and we'll share screens and figure it all out. Once again, this is how the metadata XML file is created. And then steps 5 and 6 on matching up everything else to make it all work. So that being the case, thank you. I'm going to take questions. I see things are just rolling in as we speak. What I'd like to do is I'm going to try and go out to my active desktop at some point if somebody can tell me how to do that.
All right, well, first let's go through the questions we got in the chat box. Liz asked earlier on if the governor's office provided any information or description up front as to the content of the folders that we got. For example, were text files, were they outgoing letters while PDFs were incoming correspondence? Did we get any sort of information like that?
The answer to that is no. What we got was the thumb drive with the 5 folders in the Access database. There was a cover letter that came with the folded into the envelope that sort of described that this came out of IQ and did a brief description of how to access information, but it did not tell us what the individual folders were composed of. Primarily, it didn't say, that all text files are going to be this format or this type of correspondence. It was purely a matter of which folder they were tucked into, really, that gave an indication of what it was for. Obviously, the incoming and outgoing are self-explanatory, but the IMA and IMAIL were sort of not described very well, although it turned out to be that through the process of elimination and going through the data and spending weeks looking at the tables, the IMA and IMAIL folders were for attachments to the incoming and outgoing correspondence, but they were mixed up, even though they said that one was for incoming attachment and one was for outgoing attachments. That turned out not to be the case, which sort of leads me to believe some insight into the IQ system that it's not neat as tidy as they like to claim it to be.
Okay, we're going to go on to the next one that came in from Mark Myers. Is the address and email address that would have been provided in this metadata, are those covered by our open records law?
Well, Mark, that's a good question, and leave it to you to ask that. I would say our open records law doesn't actually cover that per se. We have PII and things that we don't present. One of the things you don't do is issue people's email addresses, phone numbers, if you can help it. Address is another thing. One of the things we do state that if you send something into to a public institution, you thereby giving your permission to put it out there, although we take a more reasonable approach to that, saying, obviously Social Security numbers, driver's license number. We just didn't feel it was appropriate to put out. We have some high-profile individuals that are included in this correspondence, politicians and other people, as well as private individuals that would submit their phone numbers, email addresses if it came in through an email, and or their snail mail addresses as well. And what we did was we felt there was some amount of research value in allowing the researcher to look for a correspondence based upon region or city, but we didn't include actual street addresses. We redacted those sorts of information purely as whether it's required by the open records law or not. We just withheld that for privacy issues, just to make sure that it didn't come back on us at that point.
Our next question was more of a question to the group, but Veronica Martzel in Massachusetts was just wondering about other states demonstrating how they create XML files, and she mentioned creating XML directly from Excel, which we then got around to covering, which is that process that the streamlined process at the end. Rebecca Katz wanted to know if we have an ingesting IQ to your state archives for dummies document.
No, but I can maybe work on one if someone would like that. I think it's probably a good idea for me to get back to the profession at some point in my life. Lord knows I've taken enough from it as it is. So yeah, I think we could certainly work with that. But I have to say, ultimately I didn't actually ingest from IQ. I ingested from Access. But the biggest thing I think was the working with the agency, the records creators, to help them understand that the governor's office is a little bit easier to deal with because they have a concern with posterity and their public reaction, or the access to their records for posterity and going forward. You can't write the history of the governor's office without the governor's records, and if the governor's records are in a system that nobody can get to, well, that's going to affect your perception among the public and historians out there. And then kudos to our governor's office, and at least Governor Haley's office. She campaigned on a open, transparency in government platform, and so she was very open. And we got a wealth of information from the governor's office, not only including this IQ data, but they understood that they needed to provide it to us. We couldn't deal with the raw IQ data the way it was, and they were fully on board and willing to ensure that we got the data in a format that we were able to make use of. And so it's as the IQ has started to permeate across state governments, I think the word is getting back to them, because I get the sense from talking to colleagues at professional conferences and other things, they're still worried about IQ, but I think the impending looming doom that we all felt even as short ago as 2 years ago is not there anymore. I think, notwithstanding Alabama's experience with IQ, that they're coming to realize that they have a responsibility at Lockheed Martin, Leidos, or whoever, that they've got to provide this information at some point, and hopefully the records creators are going to shoulder the burden. And we've been successful at transferring or letting the records creators know that this is a responsibility on their part, because ultimately they buy the systems. They have to give the records up in some format that is usable by somebody, because otherwise why keep them? So I'm not sure if I answered your question or not, but my long and short answer of it is that I think that going forward that we're going to be much more successful in getting records that are usable either in IQ or out of the IQ system, that will each and every one of us will hopefully be able to manipulate in some format or provide access to the records.
So I think the answer to that question was we can definitely work on a For Dummies document.
Oh, yeah, that's where we're at.
Our next question was from Mark again. Could you or did you ever request the raw data from Lockheed?
We never did. I've been in contact with Lockheed Martin twice. Both times they were coming to the archives trying to sell me on the IQ system for our own records. And I tried to patiently describe to them that we are the state archives and we know how to deal with records and we don't lose records. And their system could never function for us. And then when I turned it around to them and asked them if they would give us a dump of the data at the end of it, and they hemmed and hawed. Once again, this was over 2 years ago, so I'm sure things have changed. But we were never in direct contact with Lockheed Martin vis-a-vis the governor's records. The governor's office actually handled this process prior to us even requesting the records from them at the close of the administration. So the groundwork that we laid back in 2014, before they got the system, paid dividends and was very fruitful at the end of it. In 2017, when we got the records, the governor's office was prepared to transfer them to us in a format that we'd previously said was usable by us, and they did so, and did so gratefully and gladly.
Okay, next we just have a couple of comments from Greta. I guess they were working with IQ to extract correspondence, starting with the Kane administration in Virginia, and that seems like there were some false starts, but it looks like they've improved the extraction method by the time they got to us, and it sounds like Virginia's now moved to Microsoft CRM, which provides a different set of challenges. And she also mentioned that making sure that contracts with Lockheed explicitly state the responsibility is what's vital. I have a question from Rachel Smith in Alabama. Were there any concerns about ingesting constituent correspondence to a public access site with potential PII and sensitive content?
Yes, we're concerned with PII and sensitive content. I personally take the approach that if you are submitting stuff to a public institution, and the governor's office in particular, you've given tacit approval for that stuff to be made public, because open transparency laws, or at least open government, states that stuff. The goal is to make it accessible so everybody knows what's going on. That being said, we certainly look for PII, and if we encounter it, we redact it. We ran Bit Curator against all the folders looking for this information, and when we encountered that sort of stuff, or the PII information, we redacted it in the files, or we pulled those files out of the system and stored them separately. So it's one of the things we're concerned about, but there's only so much you can do, and hopefully if someone runs across something, or during the process of doing research, if a researcher brings that to our attention, we remove that stuff.
Our next question is from Brian Thomas. When you say redacted, do you mean stripped from the metadata or choosing not to render? I think we're talking about the address and emails again.
Yeah, we try and do both, Brian. We strip it from the metadata, and if we choose it, we try not to render it as well.
All right. Next question is from William Branch. How much manpower did the project require, and how many man-hours to complete it?
Well, when we started this process, it was me. So man-hours were 1 man-hour for 2 or 3 months, essentially. It took me a lot of false starts and stuff. We had a big gap in terms of the process, because our Preservica instance had a glitch in it for like 6 months that we were working with Preservica to try and work out. So from the initial transfer of the records to the eventual publishing of them, or making them available through Preservica, was actually about 6 months. And during that time, I sort of took a break from working with the raw data. But the 12-step process, for me to work on a particular folder that had anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 items in it, would take me roughly, myself working by myself at the computer, 7.5, 8 hour day. It took me about 2.5 weeks to do. So I'm not good at math, but there's some number of hours in there. And that basically was a lot of false starts. I'd do a step and realize there was an error in it, and have to take a step, literally take a step back away from my desk without banging my head on it to start over with the process. But once we figured out what we were doing, where the pitfalls were, where the errors that showed up in common amongst all the folders and the files, it would take me 4 days, typically 4 to 5 days to work through that process. Now it takes us, an afternoon. So it's much more streamlined, much more efficient now. And the end-all result of this being, of course, what I was doing was a very hands-on manual work in terms of electronic records. There's processes out there, not outside of what Morgan worked on, that reduced it to 6. I had an exposure to SQL Server and that data set, or that database structure, which is very intuitive, and I'm actually starting to learn how to do SQL programming because it has possibilities to take metadata and data such as what we got out of IQ and manipulate it much quicker, much faster, and more powerful than even we've experienced before. SQL is a fabulous program.
Our next question is from Brian Thomas again. Would it have been possible to get the raw database even if they didn't explain it?
I probably think we could request that from the governor's office. We didn't actually do that because they gave us such a wealth, and maybe not a wealth, but they gave us what they felt comfortable giving us at the time. I've since worked up a really good working relationship with the records officer at the governor's office, and I could probably request that. With the next, the governor that replaced Governor Haley is still in office, and he just won re-election, so we're not going to see anything for another 4.5 or 3.5 years, I suspect. But at that time, I'll probably ask for the full database, or at least the data from the database.
Well, I guess, Brian, that was going to be my question: is what are we going to ask for next time to get out of? Because we got the Access database this time. What is our ideal for getting from them in the future?
My hope is that I would like to see the actual raw data, the tables in IQ, Oracle. I think somebody posted that it was in an Oracle. And see if we can't transform that based upon the raw data to manipulate it as well. I think these are skills that we as archivists are going to have to learn, and it's frightening to think about. I grew up, I was trained as a paper-based archivist. I want to go into the stacks and open up a box and rifle through the papers, but I think the future is here. This is what it looks like, and it's powerful to think that you can go through so many documents in such a short amount of time and provide item-level indexing to where you can Google search, essentially put in a name or a topic and return 5, 10, 20 hits that are all relevant, and do it in a matter of days versus processing that stuff by paper would have taken years. So I'm excited for the future. I'm not sure what we're going to get in the future, but it's worth looking for, and the ability that we've been able to magnify the process to include other sorts of records that come out like CSV files. When I go talk to agencies about their records, and they say, well, we've got these sorts of records, and my immediate next question to them is, well, how are you accessing those records? And a lot of times they'll say some sort of homegrown or some off-the-shelf program, proprietary software. And I said, well, is there a back end to it? Can you give me the dump of the data? And they'll hem and they'll haw, and then eventually some IT guy will walk in the room and says, yeah, I can give you a CSV file. And it all evaporates. My fears and concerns, because once I get a CSV file, I can provide access to it as long as I have the raw the documents themselves in whatever format they're in, whether it be a picture, a PDF, a .doc, a HTML or TXT file. If I have the metadata to match up to the individual record, I can provide access to it.
Well, I think we'll just close out with this final musing question that we got from Brian Thomas about would it be possible to consider the database a record instead of a metadata container?
Oh, we certainly do. We've ingested that as a record itself because that's the way it was transferred to us. But you can't, query the database and preserve it. But you can certainly pull this metadata back out of it to provide access to the actual records themselves.
All right. Well, I think thank you, Brian, for leading us through that. If anyone, actually, Becky, can you transfer control of the slide deck back to me? If anyone has any questions, we can get contact information to you And we do appreciate your feedback after you exit the webinar. You'll automatically be taken to an online webinar evaluation, so please do let us know what you thought. Take a couple of minutes to complete the survey. That way we can figure out next season what is of interest to people for future webinars. Stay connected and informed. These are all the ways you can keep in touch with COSA. So it's worth staying in touch. Appreciate everyone's questions, and we'd like to thank everyone for attending. We do have more webinars coming up, so please don't forget Alabama's will be next month, about a month from now, actually in June, and we look forward to that. And I believe there will be a recording of this webinar available as well after the fact. And like I said, I know Brian is willing to take questions after the webinar in terms of if anyone has very specific questions, either about the old process of the 12 steps or the new process of the 6 steps, or just how Brian has been dealing with getting people to get on board in general. So thank you all, and hope you have a great afternoon. Oh yes, and Barbara's reminding me that the recording will be posted on the website and on COSA's YouTube page. So thank you all.